It all began with something small, almost harmless. A few chickens in the backyard. Not loud roosters, not a sprawling farm, just a handful of hens pecking at the grass, scratching at the dirt, and producing fresh eggs every morning. For the homeowner, it was a little slice of peace, a way to live closer to nature in the middle of a suburban neighborhood. The clucks of the hens were soft, almost soothing, far quieter than the barking dogs that echoed through the streets at night. The chickens were never meant to cause problems, only to provide food and a sense of connection. But in neighborhoods ruled by HOAs, even the smallest hobby can spark a storm. At first, there were whispers. A neighbor leaning over the fence asking if the homeowner was running a farm now. A suspicious glance from someone walking their dog past the yard. A few disapproving looks at community events. The chickens, though harmless, became a symbol. To some, they represented freedom and self-sufficiency. To others, they were an attack on the uniform image of suburbia that the HOA worked so hard to maintain. The first official notice arrived in a crisp white envelope. Folded neatly inside was a warning. The HOA had received complaints. The chickens, it said, violated community guidelines. The rules, according to the HOA, did not specifically allow livestock. That word, livestock, was bolded, underlined, and printed in all capital letters. But nowhere in the rules was there an explicit ban on backyard hens. Still, the HOA framed it as a violation, threatening fines if the chickens weren't removed. For most people, that letter might have been enough, a warning shot to scare them into submission. But not this homeowner. They read the guidelines line by line, word by word, searching for the exact clause. They found plenty of vague language about property appearance, noise control, and community standards, but nothing that directly prohibited hens. It was a loophole, but the kind of loophole HOAs hated, the kind they would fight tooth and nail to close. At first, the homeowner tried to play it calm. They sent a polite response explaining that the hens were quiet, contained, and not in violation of any specific rule. They even included photos showing how tidy and well-kept the chicken coop was. It was hardly visible from the street, nestled behind a wooden fence and shaded by a few trees. To anyone not looking for trouble, it was a simple, clean setup. But the HOA didn't see it that way. To them, the chickens were a threat, not because of noise or smell, but because of control. If one homeowner could keep hens, what would stop another from bringing in goats or pigs, or worse? The HOA thrived on order, and chickens represented chaos. So they doubled down. More letters followed, each one more aggressive than the last. They warned of escalating fines, legal action, even potential liens against the property. The homeowner began to feel the pressure. Some neighbors voiced support, quietly saying they didn't mind the hens at all. But others sided with the HOA, glaring across the street, muttering about rules being rules. The chickens, innocent creatures scratching in the dirt, had become a dividing line in the neighborhood. The air grew heavy with tension, every HOA meeting becoming a stage for whispered accusations and side-eyed glances. Then came the notice that pushed everything over the edge. The HOA issued an ultimatum: remove the chickens immediately or face maximum penalties. They called the hens a nuisance, claimed they threatened property values, and suggested that the homeowner was undermining the entire community's image. It wasn't just about the birds anymore. It was about power. The HOA wanted obedience, but instead of giving in, the homeowner decided on something unexpected. If the HOA wanted a fight, they would get one. But it wouldn't be a shouting match at meetings or a quiet surrender behind closed doors. No, the homeowner would make a statement, a bold one. one that would turn the HOA's obsession with appearances against them. The idea was simple, yet outrageous. If the HOA wanted to treat a modest chicken coop like a crime, then the chickens would get the biggest, most extravagant upgrade anyone had ever seen. Not just a coop, not just a shed. A mansion. The homeowner began sketching plans late into the night, fueled by frustration and determination. The design was outrageous. Sprawling runs, decorative windows, flower boxes, and miniature doors. It would be cleaner, safer, and more beautiful than many of the houses in the neighborhood. If the HOA claimed the chickens lowered property values, this chicken mansion would do the opposite. It would make people stop in awe. But behind the humor of the idea was something deeper. This wasn't just about chickens anymore. It was about standing up to an HOA that thrived on control and intimidation. It was about showing that individuality couldn't be stamped out by a handful of board members with clipboards and rule books. And so, while the HOA sharpened its claws, waiting for the homeowner to give in, the first materials for the mansion arrived. Lumber stacked in the driveway. Bags of cement leaned against the fence. Decorative trim, small glass panes, and even roofing shingles appeared one by one. Neighbors paused, some curious, some annoyed, as construction began. What none of them realized yet was just how far this project would go. What started as a small backyard hobby had grown into a full-scale rebellion, one that would transform the quiet suburban street into a battleground of pride, stubbornness, and spectacle. The chickens, blissfully unaware, clucked softly as their future palace began to rise. And as the sound of hammers echoed across the neighborhood, the HOA prepared to unleash its next wave of resistance. The battle between the chickens and the HOA was only just beginning. The sound of construction filled the street. Hammers struck nails, saws cut through lumber, and the steady rhythm of progress echoed over the neatly trimmed lawns. For a neighborhood where the loudest noise usually came from lawnmowers on Saturday mornings, the activity stood out. Every day, more materials arrived. What started as a pile of boards and tools quickly transformed into the skeleton of a structure larger than anyone expected. At first, the neighbors thought it might be a shed, perhaps an elaborate storage building or a backyard workshop. But as the walls went up and the design took shape, it became clear that this was something else entirely. The structure had intricate details, arched windows, decorative trim, flower boxes along the edges. It wasn't just functional, it was beautiful. And that's when the rumors started spreading. Word trickled through the neighborhood. The homeowner was building a mansion for the chickens. Some laughed, assuming it was a joke. Others were horrified, convinced it was an act of defiance meant to mock the HOA. But the truth was somewhere in between. It was both a sanctuary for the hens and a direct response to the pressure from the association. The homeowner poured heart and soul into the project. Every day after work, hours were spent cutting, sanding, painting, and assembling. The frame became walls, the walls became rooms, and the rooms became decorated spaces designed for comfort and cleanliness. Each hen would have more than enough room to roam, with special nesting boxes lined with fresh straw and ventilation carefully placed for airflow. Even the flooring was elevated, making it easier to clean and preventing pests. The attention to detail was staggering. There were stained glass-style panels crafted from colored plastic, casting a warm glow inside when the sun hit just right. Tiny shutters framed each window, painted in a deep green that matched the trim of the main house. A miniature front porch extended outward, complete with handrails and a decorative lantern hanging above. It was whimsical, creative, and utterly defiant. The chickens, unaware of the spectacle, continued their usual routines. They scratched at the grass, dust-bathed in the warm soil, and laid eggs as though nothing unusual was happening. To them, it was just another day in the yard. But to the neighbors watching from across the street, it was a rebellion. The HOA board members, of course, were not amused. They sent representatives to the property, clipboards in hand, circling the growing structure and scribbling notes furiously. They measured distances, inspected materials, and whispered to one another with disapproval written across their faces. Soon enough, another letter arrived, this one filled with accusations. The HOA claimed the mansion was an unauthorized outbuilding, violating architectural guidelines. They argued it disrupted the uniform aesthetic of the neighborhood. They even went as far as to suggest that the size and design of the structure could attract unwanted attention and lower property values. To them, it wasn't just about chickens anymore. It was about control slipping through their fingers. But the homeowner was prepared. Every design choice had been carefully researched. Permits had been checked, building codes reviewed, and measurements taken to ensure compliance. The HOA could complain, but they couldn't point to a single law or city code that was broken. The mansion, as extravagant as it was, fell within the rules. It was a move that left the HOA fuming. Neighbors began taking sides more openly now. Some admired the determination, praising the creativity, and even bringing their children over to peek at the construction. Others scowled, whispering about lawsuits and making an example out of them. The street, once a place of casual waves and small talk, turned into a stage for tension. The mansion continued to rise, growing more impressive with each passing day. A small picket fence was added around the perimeter, painted white to contrast against the rich green shutters. Planters filled with flowers were placed along the edges, bright blooms spilling color across the yard. A weather vane, shaped like a chicken, spun gently on top of the roof. The project wasn't just functional, it was art. By the time the finishing touches were added, the mansion stood as a monument to defiance. It was large enough to house far more chickens than the homeowner owned, with space for roosting, feeding, and free-ranging in style. The chickens moved in, exploring their new quarters with curiosity, clucking softly as though approving of their upgraded home. But while the homeowner celebrated a victory in creativity and determination, the HOA saw it as an insult. They met, behind closed doors, whispering about next steps. They weren't done yet. They couldn't afford to be. If one person stood up to them successfully, others might follow. And in their eyes, that was unacceptable. The war was no longer about chickens or a coop. It was about power, image, and control. The mansion stood proudly in the backyard, a gleaming reminder that the HOA's threats hadn't worked. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. The HOA was preparing to escalate, and this time, they were determined to strike harder. For now, though, the homeowner looked at the completed mansion with pride. The chickens were safe, happy, and thriving. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. And as the sun set over the extravagant little palace, the HOA's next move loomed on the horizon. The mansion stood proudly in the backyard, its windows glinting in the sun, its tiny porch casting a neat shadow across the grass. Neighbors slowed their cars just to take a look. Some snapped photos, others shook their heads in disbelief. The chickens clucked happily in their new palace, oblivious to the storm it had stirred. But while the homeowner admired their work, the HOA was far from finished. The first retaliation came in the form of fines. Crisp envelopes began arriving weekly, each one stamped with bold lettering, "Notice of Violation." Inside, the board listed fabricated infractions. They claimed the mansion was too tall, exceeding height restrictions. They accused the homeowner of creating an unapproved structure. They even alleged that the smell from the chickens was a nuisance, despite multiple neighbors testifying there was no odor at all. The fines stacked up. each letter adding hundreds of dollars to an imaginary balance. But the homeowner refused to pay. They kept records, saved every letter, and highlighted every inconsistency. They knew these fines were unenforceable, desperate, attempts to intimidate. Still, the stress grew. Each trip to the mailbox became a battle. Each envelope was another reminder that the HOA wouldn't stop until they got their way. When the fines didn't work, the HOA tried public shaming. At the next community meeting, board members singled out the homeowner, painting them as a reckless rule breaker who threatened the neighborhood's values. They spoke in dramatic tones, warning that if the mansion was allowed to remain, the entire community would spiral into chaos. They conjured images of goats grazing on lawns, pigs rolling in flower beds, and the neighborhood turning into a farmyard free-for-all. It was a performance meant to spark outrage. But something unexpected happened. Not everyone bought into the fear. Some residents, tired of the HOA's heavy-handed tactics, began to question the board. They asked why chickens, quiet and contained, were considered more disruptive than barking dogs or late-night parties. They asked why the mansion, beautifully designed and well-kept, was seen as a threat rather than a point of pride. The board didn't have good answers. Frustrated, the HOA escalated again. They sent inspectors to the property, prowling around with measuring tapes and cameras. They claimed they were documenting violations, but to the homeowner, it felt more like harassment. On multiple occasions, the inspectors lingered too long, peering over fences, taking photos without permission. It was invasive, unsettling, and only fueled the determination to fight back. The homeowner didn't hide. Instead, they leaned into the spectacle. They decorated the mansion even more, adding fairy lights along the roofline, small flags in the flower boxes, and a neatly painted sign that read, "Cluckingham Palace." The chickens strutted around proudly, their mansion glowing in the evening like a beacon of resistance. It wasn't just a coop anymore. It was a symbol. The more the HOA pushed, the more attention the story drew. Neighbors posted photos online, sharing the tale of the mansion and the HOA's crusade against it. The posts spread quickly, reaching beyond the neighborhood. Soon, strangers were commenting, cheering on the homeowner and mocking the board's obsession. The HOA, once used to ruling quietly, found itself exposed under a spotlight it hadn't expected. But exposure didn't slow them down. If anything, it made them angrier. They filed a formal complaint with the city, hoping to catch the homeowner in a technical violation. They accused the chickens of being livestock and the mansion of being an illegal accessory dwelling unit. City inspectors arrived, walking through the yard, taking notes, and speaking with the homeowner directly. For a moment, the homeowner worried. If the city sided with the HOA, the mansion might really be in danger, but the city saw it differently. The structure was within code, properly built, and safely maintained. The hens were classified as allowable pets under local ordinances, not livestock. The inspector left with little more than a nod, telling the homeowner to keep up the good work. The HOA had lost another battle, yet losing battles didn't stop them from plotting. Behind closed doors, the board whispered about legal action. They drafted letters threatening lawsuits, hinting at liens and foreclosure if the homeowner didn't comply. It was a scare tactic, designed to make the cost of resistance seem too high. But the homeowner, now emboldened, was ready. They consulted attorneys, prepared counterclaims, and even began researching the HOA's own rule violations. The war had shifted. The homeowner was no longer just defending chickens. They were gathering ammunition for a full counterattack. Meanwhile, the mansion thrived. Visitors came by to see it, laughing at the sheer absurdity of the situation. The chickens grew healthier, their feathers glossy and full, their eggs plentiful. Children from the neighborhood asked to come feed them, parents snapping photos of their kids beside the tiny palace. What the HOA saw as a nuisance had become a source of joy and community for everyone else. But the board couldn't stand the defiance. Each day the mansion stood was, in their eyes, a reminder of their failure. And so, they prepared their most aggressive move yet. It wouldn't be another fine, or a meeting, or an inspection. This time, they were aiming to take the fight to court. As rumors of legal action spread, tension gripped the neighborhood. Some wondered if the mansion could survive the HOA's wrath. Others waited eagerly, hoping to see the board finally humbled. The chickens clucked softly in their palace, unaware that their home had become the centerpiece of a battle that was about to escalate to its peak. The stage was set for a showdown. The HOA wasn't backing down, and neither was the homeowner. And as the mansion gleamed in the afternoon sun, it stood as a promise. No matter how hard the board pushed, this fight was far from over. By now, the battle lines were clear. On one side stood the homeowner, their chickens nestled safely in the gleaming mansion that had become a neighborhood legend. On the other side stood the HOA board, their pride bruised, their authority challenged, and their frustration growing with every day the mansion remained standing. The tension that began with a simple letter had grown into a full-scale war, and the HOA was preparing to strike with their most aggressive weapon yet: legal action. The first sign came in the form of a thick envelope delivered by certified mail. It wasn't just another notice or a fine. It was a cease-and-desist letter, drafted by the HOA's attorney. The letter accused the homeowner of violating community covenants and threatened that if the chickens and the mansion weren't removed immediately, the board would file a lawsuit. They claimed damages, legal costs, and even hinted at placing a lien on the property. It was a scare tactic designed to intimidate, but instead of shrinking back, the homeowner saw it as proof that the board was running out of options. Behind the scenes, the homeowner had been preparing. Every notice, every letter, every unfounded accusation from the HOA had been meticulously documented. Photographs of the mansion, clean and well-kept, had been filed away. Testimonials from neighbors who supported the chickens were gathered. Copies of local ordinances confirming the legality of backyard hens were neatly organized in binders. While the HOA thought they were tightening the noose, the homeowner was quietly building a defense that could dismantle the board's claims entirely. Still, the threat of a lawsuit carried weight. Courtrooms weren't cheap, and HOAs often relied on homeowners folding under financial pressure. But the homeowner wasn't alone anymore. The story of the chicken mansion had spread beyond the neighborhood. Social media posts showcasing the elaborate co-op had gone viral, shared thousands of times. People from across the country commented, rallying behind the idea of one homeowner standing up against an overbearing HOA. Offers of advice, legal resources, and even donations began trickling in. What the HOA had intended as a private power, play had become a public spectacle, and the board's reputation was crumbling. In meetings, board members spoke in increasingly frantic tones. They complained about the mockery being made of their authority, about how their neighborhood was becoming a joke online. They insisted the lawsuit was necessary to restore order, but behind their words was desperation. Their control, once absolute, was slipping. Each viral post, each supportive comment for the homeowner, was another crack in their image. Meanwhile, the chickens lived their lives in blissful ignorance. They roosted on polished wooden beams inside their mansion, laid eggs in carefully lined boxes, and strutted around their yard without a care. To them, the war was invisible, but to everyone else they had become unlikely symbols of freedom, resilience, and defiance. The homeowner decided it was time to go on offense, rather than Wait for the HOA to file suit. They began consulting lawyers of their own. Attorneys who specialized in HOA law reviewed the board's covenants and found glaring inconsistencies. Rules were outdated, vague, and in some cases, unenforceable. Worse still, the board itself had violated multiple procedures, holding secret meetings, issuing fines without proper hearings, and using funds in questionable ways. The very authority they wielded so confidently was riddled with cracks. Armed with this information, the homeowner drafted a letter of their own. It was calm, precise, and backed with legal references. In it, they not only disputed the HOA's claims, but also warned that any attempt to take them to court would be met with a counterclaim exposing the board's misconduct. It wasn't just a defense. It was a threat to flip the tables entirely. When the letter was delivered, it sent shockwaves through the board. For years, they had been accustomed to homeowners backing down, afraid of confrontation. But this time, they were up against someone who refused to be bullied. The idea of their actions being scrutinized in a courtroom terrified them. They began to realize that pushing further could backfire spectacularly, not just legally but publicly. Their names, their decisions, their mishandling of the situation, all of it could be dragged into the spotlight. Still, pride kept them from backing down completely. They blustered, they postured, they continued sending threats. But the tone had shifted. What once carried an air of authority now reeked of desperation. Each letter became weaker, each threat more hollow. The homeowner, once nervous at the sight of HOA stationery, now opened the envelopes with a steady calm. The balance of power was changing. Outside the boardroom, the community itself was evolving. More neighbors voiced support for the chickens, some even joking about building their own coops. Children begged their parents to get hens, pointing to the mansion as proof it could be done beautifully. The homeowner's defiance had sparked something larger, a challenge to the HOA's grip on every detail of neighborhood life. But the board still had one advantage: persistence. They might have been losing in the court of public opinion, but they weren't about to give up their fight. They began drafting amendments to the covenants, trying to rewrite the rules to explicitly ban chickens and outbuildings like the mansion. If they couldn't win retroactively, they would try to crush the idea for the future. It was a move that revealed just how determined they were to erase the rebellion, no matter how long it took. For the homeowner, this was both a warning and an opportunity. The battle wasn't over. If anything, it was entering a new phase. One that would determine not only the fate of the mansion, but the very spirit of the neighborhood. Would it remain under the iron grip of an overreaching HOA, or would the chickens' victory pave the way for freedom and individuality? As the sun set over the neighborhood, the mansion stood tall, its lights twinkling in the dusk. To the board, it was an insult. To the homeowner, it was a triumph. To everyone watching from the outside, it was a story still unfolding, one that was about to reach its most dramatic chapter yet. The HOA board thought they had found their solution. If they couldn't tear down the mansion with fines, threats, or legal action, they would rewrite the rules themselves. Drafting amendments in secret meetings, the board proposed a sweeping change to the community covenants, a permanent explicit ban on chickens, coops, and any non-traditional structures in backyards. On paper, it was their final strike, an attempt to close the loopholes that had allowed the mansion to exist, but rewriting covenants wasn't as simple as sending a letter. It required a community vote. For years, these votes had been easy for the board to control. Homeowners rarely showed up, and those who did usually nodded along with whatever the board suggested. Most people wanted peace, not a fight. But this time, the mansion had changed everything. When word spread about the proposed amendment, outrage bubbled through the neighborhood. Families who had admired the chickens, children who loved visiting the mansion, and homeowners tired of the HOA's endless control began to speak out. What started as whispers turned into conversations on driveways in parks and over fences. The mansion wasn't just a building anymore. It was a rallying point. The homeowner, once isolated in their fight, suddenly had an army of supporters. Neighbors began attending HOA meetings in record numbers, packing the room until chairs ran out. They asked hard questions. They challenged the board's decisions. They demanded transparency about fines, spending, and secret votes. The board, once used to ruling unopposed, now found themselves on the defensive, scrambling for control. The rebellion wasn't just local anymore. The story of the chicken mansion had gone fully viral. News outlets picked it up, running features about the suburban standoff. Headlines called it everything from Cluckingham Palace versus the HOA to the coup that broke the board. Interviews with the homeowner appeared online, their calm defiance resonating with thousands who had their own HOA horror stories. The board, meanwhile, became infamous, villains in a story much larger than their neighborhood. As pressure mounted, cracks appeared within the HOA itself. Not every board member had the same appetite for war. Some privately admitted they regretted pushing the issue so far. Others worried about legal liability, fearing the homeowners' threatened counterclaims. The once united front fractured, with whispers of resignations and finger-pointing behind closed doors. Meanwhile, the homeowner continued to strengthen their position. The mansion was spotless, maintained with care that left no room for criticism. Flowers bloomed around the edges, the paint gleamed fresh, and the chickens looked healthier than ever. Every egg collected was a quiet victory, proof that the hens weren't a nuisance but a thriving part of the home. The homeowner even began donating excess eggs to neighbors, a gesture that built goodwill and strengthened community bonds. The amendment vote loomed, and both sides prepared. The HOA mailed stern letters urging compliance, painting visions of property values collapsing if the chickens remained. The homeowner and their allies, however, went door to door, speaking directly with neighbors, sharing the truth about the mansion and the board's overreach. They showed people the inside of the coop, the clean nesting boxes, the carefully designed ventilation. They let children feed the hens, watched their faces light up, and knew that no cold letter could compete with that. When voting day arrived, the turnout was unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen. Dozens of homeowners lined up, some carrying signs, others wearing shirts with slogans mocking the HOA's obsession. The board sat stiffly at the front of the room, faces pale as ballot after ballot was cast. For the first time, they weren't in control of the outcome. The people were. As the votes were counted, the result became clear. The amendment failed, crushed by a wave of opposition. Not only were the chickens safe, but the rebellion had cemented itself as a turning point. The HOA's grip on the neighborhood had been broken, but the victory was more than symbolic. Empowered by their success, homeowners began questioning other rules too. Why were holiday decorations limited to certain dates? Why were paint colors restricted to a tiny palette of beige and gray? Why were fines issued without proper hearings? The mansion had opened a floodgate, and the board could no longer stem the tide. For the HOA, it was humiliation. Their authority, once absolute, now lay in tatters. Their threats had backfired, their amendments had failed, and their reputation had been destroyed both locally and online. Some board members resigned under pressure, unable to withstand the backlash. Others clung stubbornly to their positions, but their power was a shadow of what it once was. For the homeowner, the victory was sweet but not yet complete. They had defended the mansion and the chickens, but they knew the board wouldn't simply disappear. There would be more battles, more attempts to claw back control. But the balance of power had shifted. The chickens were no longer just pets. They were symbols of freedom. And the mansion wasn't just a co-op. It was the castle that had sparked a revolution. As the sun set that evening, neighbors gathered in the yard, laughing, sharing food, and admiring the little palace that had brought them together. The HOA's letters sat unopened in a drawer, powerless against the sound of clucking hens and cheerful voices. But the war wasn't truly over. The board still had tricks left to play, and pride wouldn't let them surrender quietly. The final chapter of the battle was about to begin. The failed amendment vote should have been the end. For most HOAs, losing so publicly would have been enough to force retreat. But this board wasn't ready to admit defeat. Pride, bitterness, and the humiliation of becoming a viral spectacle drove them to try one last desperate move. The board called an emergency meeting announcing that extraordinary measures were necessary to restore order to the neighborhood. Behind closed doors, they discussed drastic options, reviving the lawsuit, doubling fines, and even exploring whether they could dissolve the mansion under obscure zoning technicalities. To them, the fight had become personal. The chickens were no longer the issue. The homeowner was. And in their eyes, defiance had to be punished. But outside that meeting, the tide had fully turned. Homeowners who once stayed silent were now emboldened. They packed into the clubhouse, demanding accountability. They asked to see financial records, questioned where HOA dues were going, and pressed the board about their misuse of power. Every attempt to steer the conversation back to the chickens failed. The mansion had exposed something deeper. Years of unchecked control, petty rules, and decisions made without community consent. The board was cornered, and everyone knew it. Still, the HOA tried their last weapon. They issued a final notice, declaring that the mansion must come down within 30 days or face severe legal consequences. It was their boldest, most threatening letter yet. But unlike before, it carried no weight. The community had rallied behind the homeowner, and the board's threats rang hollow. Support poured in, not just from neighbors, but from people across the country who had followed the saga online. Offers of legal aid flooded in, crowdfunding campaigns popped up overnight, and media outlets reported every twist and turn. The board's threats were drowned out by overwhelming public support. The homeowner, once a single person standing against an entire organization, now stood at the center of a movement. They didn't just ignore the letter, they exposed it. Scans of the document were shared online, where thousands mocked the HOA's desperate tone. Comment sections lit up with jokes about the chickens needing their own HOA, or the board secretly being jealous of Cluckingham Palace. The more the board pushed, the more ridiculous they looked. Within weeks, the pressure became unbearable. Board members began resigning, one after another, unable to withstand the scrutiny. Some left quietly, others bitterly, but the result was the same. The HOA was collapsing from within. With no leadership, no unity, and no credibility, the organization that had once ruled with an iron fist crumbled. The war was over. The mansion remained standing, more magnificent than ever. The homeowner added new touches in celebration. A fresh coat of paint, a small fountain nearby, and solar-powered lights that made the palace glow at night. The chickens thrived, their feathers gleaming, their clucks echoing like tiny victory songs. They were no longer just backyard hens. They were legends. But the story didn't end with victory alone. The community changed. Without the HOA's oppressive oversight, neighbors began working together voluntarily. Block parties replaced board meetings, cooperation replaced threats, and individuality flourished. People painted their homes in brighter colors, decorated their yards more freely, and found joy in shaping their neighborhood without constant interference. The mansion had sparked more than a rebellion. It had inspired freedom. For the homeowner, The victory was sweet but humbling. What began as a simple hobby had spiraled into a battle they never expected. But in the end, they had proven something important. That standing up, even in the face of endless pressure, could change everything. The chickens, simple creatures scratching in the dirt, had become the heart of a story about resilience, community, and defiance against control. The board's collapse became a cautionary tale, shared in HOA forums and news stories far beyond the neighborhood. To some, it was a warning of how power could corrupt. To others, it was an inspiration, a reminder that even the smallest act of defiance could topple giants when backed by persistence and community support. And so, as another quiet evening settled over the neighborhood, the homeowner stood in the yard watching the lights of the mansion twinkle in the dark. The chickens roosted peacefully, safe in their palace. The war was over, the neighborhood free, and the legacy of Cluckingham Palace forever etched in history. What had started with a handful of hens ended with a revolution. The chickens weren't just pets anymore. They were the reason entire community had learned to stand up, speak out, and reclaim their freedom. The HOA tried to ban them, but instead they built a mansion. And in doing so, they built something far greater, a lasting victory.